Mr. Speaker, speaking to the Canadian Injured Workers Association in July 2012, the Premier said, and I quote, "Alberta Workers' Compensation Board functions solely as a means of providing cheap insurance to Alberta employers at the expense of the dignity and the health and the future of Alberta workers." Whoops. And further, that workers, quote, "suffer the consequences of that day in and day out." Whoops. My question to the Labour Minister: in 24 days, Bill 6 will force WCB upon Alberta farm workers, even though the Premier says WCB causes workers to suffer. If the Premier is right, why are you forcing WCB on Alberta farm workers?
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member opposite for that question. And let us be clear. WCB could be better and could be improved. And our government is committed to doing the work that the previous government never did, to improve WCB. But that being said, it is far better than the alternative, which is forcing poor, vulnerable, injured workers to hire lawyers to sue insurance companies, which is the way it would work in the absence of the WCB. That is why most workers abandoned the ad idea and embraced the WCB model over 100 years ago, except farmers.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. First supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's getting crowded under the bus. Given that in the same speech the Premier states, quote, "We have a long list of how we would change Workers' Compensation Board to make it fair," and given that in the past 7 months none of these changes have been made, to the Labour Minister, why haven't you fixed all the flaws on your long list before foisting this system that the Premier says is unfair onto Alberta farmers and farm workers?
Mr. Speaker, as the member opposite probably knows, we have engaged in a review of agency boards and commissions, and the Workers' Compensation Board is part of that. So we are in the process of trying to do a fulsome consultative review of how we can improve the service provided by WCB. But that being said, it is fundamentally different than saying that you remove WCB or keep people from having access to it and tell them to sue a private insurer to try and get a fraction of the benefits, because that's what happens in the absence of WCB, and that's what we are trying to change. And then, once farm workers are covered by it, we'll improve the whole.
Premier, the second supplemental.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we hear again and again, and we heard it again today from the Premier, that the motivation behind Bill 6 is to protect injured farm workers. Now, given that Bill 6 makes WCB mandatory without provision for other forms of coverage, and given that, in her own words, WCB causes injured workers to suffer a loss of dignity and health, why are you forcing a system that you yourself have described in words that I cannot use because they're unparliamentary on the very farm workers you purport to be protecting?
Well, as I've said in the answer to the previous two questions, which I will say again, workers' compensation in Alberta, after 44 years of that government, does need to be improved. However, it is far better than there being no compensation available to workers, and far better than forcing vulnerable, injured workers to sue insurance companies to get a fraction of the benefits that they would otherwise get. So that is why we're going to move forward to protect paid farm workers in Alberta.